Hi everyone, Liz Klimek here, Planetarium Manager at the South Carolina State Museum. Well, it's finally here, the Orion episode. I have been promising to do this for a while now, but back in the fall, I was getting a little bit ahead of myself because while you could see the constellation Orion in the fall, you couldn't really do so until later in the evening. It's not really until you get into winter, like where we are now, that you can see Orion earlier in the evening. So now is a much better time to do this than it was a month or so ago. So here we go. Let's go meet up with Orion this weekend, starting Saturday, January 16th at 7 p.m. We'll look directly south from right here in Columbia, South Carolina, as we usually do, because I do want to very quickly point out our waxing crescent moon off to the southwest. You can watch that grow as it heads towards full over the next couple of weeks or so. Then also high overhead, we have the red planet Mars. Mark your calendars for February 18th. That is when NASA's Perseverance rover and Ingenuity helicopter are due to land on Mars, which I can't wait to happen. And then if we turn our gaze over to the southeast, we have a pattern of stars that really jumps out and grabs people's attention. This is a pattern of stars that, interestingly, a lot of people see as resembling some sort of person, and in Greek mythology, that would be Orion the Hunter. The stars Betelgeuse and Bellatrix form Orion's shoulders. And then the stars Saiph and Rigel form his legs or feet. Then there are three stars in a row, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, which form a belt called Orion's belt, appropriately enough. Now, these are the stars that usually define the constellation Orion. They're the ones that people usually think of the most. They're the brightest stars in this direction. So even if you have a fair amount of light pollution, you can usually pick these out. Notice that not all the stars are the same color. Betelgeuse over here looks almost like Mars with its reddish orangish tint. That's because it's a red supergiant star. Then you can compare that to this star down here, Rigel, which has a blue-blue-white hue to it, and this is a blue supergiant star. So kind of different from this one. Now the star colors tell you something about their temperature. Now in our everyday experience, we're used to red and orange representing warm and hot, and blue representing cold. But when it comes to stars, all stars are hot. They're thousands to tens of thousands of degrees, but red stars like Betelgeuse over here are cooler compared to stars like Rigel, the blue ones. Now, as I said, these are usually the main stars of Orion, but if you had access to darker skies, you might be able to see more of the stars of Orion. There are actually some dimmer stars that form an outstretched arm right here, kind of like he's holding a shield out in front of him, and then some other dim stars that form an upraised arm behind him, and also some dim stars that form a sword hanging from his belt. And all together, Orion looks something like this. Let me zoom in a little bit more here. I can zoom in a lot because we're going to focus on just this one part of the sky. Now, even if your skies aren't perfectly dark, maybe you have a little bit of light pollution, but it's not too bad. If you look at the sword stars, you might be able to see that one of those stars is kind of fuzzy, kind of looks like a little fuzzy patch. And that's because it's not a star, but a star-forming region called the Orion Nebula. Basically, a giant cloud of gas and dust in space that has so much material there that new stars are forming out of all of that stuff, even right now as we speak. I can show you a picture taken from the Hubble Space Telescope of the Orion Nebula. So there are thousands of stars that we know of so far in this cloud, and as I said, new stars are forming out of all of that gas and dust, as well as new solar systems. You can kind of think of them as little baby solar systems. So sometimes the Orion Nebula gets referred to as a stellar nursery for that reason. Now, I do have to make a little side note here about this picture, because sometimes when I show people this image, or if I have the opportunity to show the Orion Nebula through the eyepiece of a telescope, every once in a while I'll hear somebody exclaim, "Oh, look, I can see Orion's belt." Now, if you do see three stars in this image, those are not the belt stars, because the belt stars are not in the Orion Nebula, they are above the Orion Nebula. So here are the belt stars, and here is the Orion Nebula. So when you look at the Orion Nebula through a telescope, that telescope is aimed on this, or aimed at this object, and is basically focused in on that tiny patch of sky and is magnifying that tiny patch of sky. There's no way to get all of the belt stars in the eyepiece of a telescope, and besides, they're not in the same part of the sky to begin with. The belt stars are, again, above everything in the sword. And so if you see three stars in a row in this image, or in the eyepiece when you look at the Orion Nebula, you are simply seeing three stars that happen to form a line. Now, it's hard to see in this image, but nestled at the very, very center, the very heart of this nebula, is a cluster of stars called the Trapezium. Let me bring up an image of that, also taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. So those very bright stars at the center of the Orion Nebula are so named the Trapezium because they kind of form a trapezoidal shape. They're very massive, very young stars. And the intense UV radiation and winds from these stars are basically carving out cavities in the cloud, pushing away materials. You can kind of think of them as kind of like they're blowing bubbles in the gas. And that intense starlight is also ionizing the gas, basically stripping away the electrons from the hydrogen atoms. These clouds are mostly hydrogen gas, and all that intense radiation kind of separates the electrons from the protons. But then those electrons join back up with the protons eventually to reform hydrogen, and light is released in that process, and that causes the gas to glow. So when you see the nice warm glow of the Orion Nebula, just think of all those happy electron-proton reunions that are happening. And I'll take that off. Now, this is how we're used to seeing Orion in the sky. Those bright stars, and if your sky conditions are good enough, maybe you can see the Orion Nebula appear. But actually, if your eyes were able to detect the very, very faint light coming from this part of the sky, you'd be able to see that there's a lot more there. It turns out that the Orion Nebula is part of a much bigger structure, something called the Orion Molecular Complex. So lots of different nebulae and cloud structures that kind of span the entire constellation of Orion. And I have a picture of that to give you an idea of what is there and what you could see if your eyes, as I said, were really, really sensitive and could pick up that faint light coming from this direction. So hopefully in this image you can see Orion. I know there's a lot more stars in this image, but he's kind of standing up right there with his shoulder stars towards the top, and there's kind of a fuzzy patch up here, kind of where Orion's head would be, and also there is a big loop of gas here called Barnard's Loop. It kind of makes Orion look like Santa Claus a little bit, with a big belly and his head up here. Barnard's Loop is a shell of gas with an unknown origin. So perhaps a supernova exploded somewhere in this region and blew out this big kind of arc of gas. Maybe something like that. There are also lots of other nebulae in this part of the sky that I can't really show you in this image here, but you can go on the internet, look them up. There's the Horsehead Nebula, the Witchhead Nebula, the Flame Nebula, and others that I'm totally forgetting about. So there are lots of neat structures that span hundreds of light years and just stretch across, as I said, this entire constellation. So it's really cool to think about what's all that is really there in that part of the sky that we just can't see. You need a timed exposure or stacked images like this one here in order to be able to pick up and see that light. Well, I hope this gives you a new appreciation for the constellation of Orion and this part of the sky in general. Go outside one of these clear early evenings and definitely check that out. And I hope you enjoyed this Orion special episode. If you would like to learn more about astronomy, don't forget that the Boeing Observatory here at the State Museum does a live stream currently on Facebook every Saturday at 7 o'clock. So be sure to tune in and bring your astronomy questions. We always love to get those. And as always, take care of yourselves. Definitely take care of each other. Don't forget to click below to like, subscribe, comment, share, all that good stuff. And don't forget to tune in next time. Until then, bye-bye for now.